December 14th, 1944, 7:18 p.m., Madison County, North Carolina. The wind knifed through the hollows like it had a grudge. At the edge of the pine-sheltered chapel, 13 women, German prisoners captured in the Ardennes, huddled in wool coats already stiff with frost. Then the door creaked open, and silence met warmth. On each wooden pew, a folded quilt waited, hand-stitched, mountain-dyed, still holding the faint scent of hearth smoke and lilac. One prisoner whispered, stunned, "Sie haben das für uns gemacht?" They thought America would break them. Instead, it wrapped them in threadbare mercy. They had begun weeks earlier, before the frost bit through the floorboards, before the prisoners were ever rerouted to this corner of the Appalachians, when word spread that German women, soldiers' helpmates, would be wintering in barracks 3 miles from town. The initial response was silence, a communal holding of breath behind curtained windows and folded arms at Wednesday prayer. But silence has a way of turning inwards, and in the quilting room beneath the church, where the walls smelled of starch and cedar oil, the women of the circle began to murmur. First, it was practical. "They'll freeze if they're housed in that tobacco barn," someone said. Then, "The army won't give them more than 2 blankets. And then finally, the question that wouldn't leave. What if it were our girls? It was Miss Ellermay who brought down the first bundle, a frayed cotton sheet and 2 sacks of wool, pulled from a chest that hadn't been opened since her son's ship was sunk off the coast of Sicily. Others followed. Laura Finch donated her husband's woolen trousers, too worn for wear, but thick enough to be reborn as warmth. Mrs. Jenkins, who hadn't spoken to a German in 26 years, not since her grandfather's stories from the Great War, sat quietly with a pile of calico, her knuckles white with resolve. They worked in near silence, interrupted only by the occasional hymn hummed low or the snap of a thread drawn too tight. Names were stitched inside corners not for glory, but to bear witness. Every night the circle grew, younger women learning to bind edges from grandmothers, widows teaching Sunday school girls to tuck batting just so, fingers calloused not by mills, but by mercy. The scraps came from everywhere, pillowcases, apron hems, curtains too faded for use, and each told its own quiet story. One square was cut from a child's Sunday dress, sky blue with a faded rosebud print, another from a wedding tablecloth, yellowed and lined with lace. They didn't talk much about the recipients. Some feared judgment, others shame, but all knew what they were doing. This was not a gift, not an apology, not even forgiveness. It was something stranger, preparation for something the war had made nearly impossible, a moment when both hands and heart might thaw at once. Outside, ration trucks groaned through the hills, and the headlines spoke only of Bastogne and Berlin. But inside that room, a different kind of campaign was underway. One measured not in victories or casualties, but in warmth per stitch, in silence broken only by breath and fabric. And when the final knots were tied, each quilt folded and labeled with nothing more than a penciled number, they were stacked in a pine-wood chest near the altar, awaiting their unlikely purpose. There was no ceremony, no photograph, no proclamation, only a shared glance between women who had done something irrevocable, made space in a season of war for softness. They gathered beneath the sloped tin roof of the church basement, where the smell of mothballs mingled with strong coffee and the sigh of creaking floorboards above, forming what they came to call the blanket circle, not out of ceremony, but because every circle needs a name, even one forged from necessity. There were 27 of them at first, most over 50, their hands weathered by mountain winters, soap barrels, and the slow undoing of their son's absence. Some bore grief openly, like Mrs. Tuttle, who wore her boy's dog tags on a ribbon under her blouse, fingers instinctively curling around them whenever someone mentioned Europe. Others stitched silently, allowing the cloth to speak where mouths could not. They sat on mismatched chairs around long folding tables, each woman arriving with a bundle tucked under her arm. Old skirts gone threadbare, feed sacks bleached clean, muslin salvaged from funeral linens that had done their duty. The air was thick with the hiss of lanterns and the rhythmic pull of needles, punctuated by questions no one dared ask aloud. What if he's cold? What if he's hungry? What if he's not coming home? The quilts began as practical things, layers against wind and ice, but as the work progressed, they became repositories for unspoken prayers, stitched with verses, initials, and scraps too sentimental to discard. A ledger in the vestibule recorded each woman's name beside a tally of squares completed. 3 for Ruth Collins, who lost her brother at Anzio. 5 for Eula May, who sewed barefoot, rocking her youngest with one foot as she basted seams. 9 for Letty Johnson, who never said a word about the war, only nodded when asked if she'd keep sewing. They worked without fanfare, and when whispers spread that the recipients would be German prisoners, women too, though uniformed and foreign, there was a silence sharper than any needle's point. Some paused, hands stilled mid-stitch. Others stared at their fabric as if it might answer for them. Then Mrs. Avery, who had once taught Latin before the Depression closed the school, said simply, "If we were in their boots." And the needles resumed. The quilts would not be beautiful in the traditional sense, no fancy patterns or embroidery flourishes, but each square bore the mark of care. A patch matched with deliberation, a corner reinforced with extra thread, a seam pressed flatter than it needed to be. They did not expect thanks. Most assumed the quilts would be issued anonymously, a logistical note buried in some army memo. But it didn't matter. What mattered was doing it anyway, defying the frost not just outside, but within. The youngest in the group, barely 20, asked if it was right to help the enemy. The oldest, nearly 80 and half-blind, replied, "There's cold, and then there's cruelty. We can't fix the first by choosing the second." And with that, the blanket circle grew, warped, threadbare, unglamorous, but unmistakably human. They had braced for spit, for fists, for the snapping of dogs and boots in rhythm. Some even whispered that American prisons were underground, windowless, the sort of places where captives vanished beneath fluorescent lights and humiliation. The convoy that carried them south was silent but tense. Heads down, hands stiff on knees, eyes catching only glimpses of pine branches and frozen creeks through slatted truck panels. In Aachen, they'd been screamed at. In Belgium, shoved into rail cars. But when the tailgate dropped in Madison County and the mountain air hit their lungs, clean, sharp, oddly sweet, they saw no wire fences, no stone walls, only 2 men in brown coats leaning against a rust-colored truck, thumbing tin cups of coffee. One of them said, "Y'all must be cold." With such quiet certainty, it startled them more than a rifle would have. The barracks were crude but dry, and the meals came with cornbread. Their work detail involved stacking firewood, not dragging wire or hauling gravel. And when a woman asked for another bucket of coal, the guard obliged, muttering, "Reckon you can't sew if your fingers turn blue." It didn't fit anything they'd been told. A diary, recovered later from under a mattress, bore a single line dated 3 days after arrival. "We will not be spoken to. No one will look at us." But they had been spoken to, asked about headaches, told to watch their step on the frozen path. No one had shouted Nazi, and no one spat, though one local boy did stare too long before his mother yanked him away, muttering, "Don't stare, Caleb. They're just women." In Germany, their instructors had warned that capture meant shame. Here, it meant confusion. The uniforms they wore, navy skirts, thick stockings, and woolen overcoats bearing faded insignia, felt heavier with every kind gesture. At mess, they sat with distance between them, but there was no wire dividing the room. One woman cried quietly over her stew and was offered a ragged napkin. Another was surprised to find soap in the wash basin, carved with a floral edge as if someone had gone to trouble just for them. Each day chipped away at what they thought they knew: that Americans were savage, that southern mountain folk were ignorant, that capture would be punishment and erasure. Instead, they found themselves seen, not fully welcomed, but not erased either. A woman from Leipzig, once a typist in a Wehrmacht office, confided during interrogation, "We thought you'd break us with your hatred." The translator had only blinked and said, "Ma'am, this here's a church town. We got other ways." And so the irony mounted, day after day, more destabilizing than discipline. Mercy where there should have been mockery, eye contact instead of ice. It was not forgiveness. It was something stranger, and to many, far more disarming. The chapel stood like a quiet sentinel at the edge of the forest, its steep pitched roof slick with frost, its clapboard siding faded to the color of old paper, and its windows trembling lightly in their frames each time a wind curled down from the ridge. Inside, the pine floorboards bore the scuff of generations, boots from revival nights, bare feet from summer baptisms, and now the tread of guards and POWs whose presence turned sacred ground into something uncertain. It was neither prison nor sanctuary, a space repurposed by necessity and restraint, where no crosses had been taken down, but no sermons were preached. The iron stove in the corner huffed out waves of coal heat, its flue rattling when the fire caught too fast, and the air inside always carried the twin scents of cedar polish and scorched wool. At the far end of the nave, on the same altar where hymns had once risen, a pinewood chest now rested, lid propped open, quilts spilling over its edges like tongues of color in a winter sea. They arrived in no ceremony, only with the soft creak of the side door and the shuffle of feet. Baskets borne by women with red cheeks and quiet eyes, each containing a stack folded with geometric precision. Some quilts bore initials, RT, LJ, CH, stitched in thread the color of rust or cream. Others carried entire verses along their seams, barely visible unless held to the light. I was naked, and ye clothed me. Love thy enemy. They also serve who only stand and wait. These were not tokens, nor gestures meant to be deciphered. They were insulation, made stitch by stitch with the same urgency one chops wood before dusk. The chapel became a kind of third space, suspended between duty and grace. Here, language faltered, but eyes met. Here, guards stepped back into the shadows, letting warmth speak in their place. When the German women entered, single file, coats buttoned high, boots leaving damp marks on the floor, they paused, not at the stove, or even the sight of the pews, but at the quilts. Some reached out, fingertips hovering just above the seams, as though contact might violate some unspoken rule. Others looked to the guards for permission, unsure whether this softness was allowed. There were no orders, no barked commands, only the creak of a pew as one woman finally sat, quilt draped over her lap like a mantle. She didn't smile, but she didn't flinch either. The frost on the windows began to bead and run, chased by the rising warmth inside. In that moment, the chapel was not holy ground, and it was not a holding cell. It was a pause, drawn between two vast silences, one of war, the other of waiting. And in that pause, the quilts held the line against the cold, not with symbolism, but with the literal weight of care. They had not expected to survive the winter, let alone be sent across the sea. Most of them, auxiliary nurses, typists, signal women, were caught in the final chaos outside Aachen. when the Allied advance moved faster than orders could keep pace, and command posts became battlegrounds overnight. The fog had rolled in thick that morning, curling through the stone streets and clogging the ears with distant shell bursts. And when the Americans came, they didn't shout. They pointed. They herded. They disarmed. Some women tried to burn papers. Others clutched small tins of morphine or crumpled photographs. But for most, the moment of capture came with a strange, sudden stillness, like the ending of a long-held breath. They were processed quickly. Names recorded, ranks clarified, civilian affiliations noted, and loaded onto trucks headed west. A few tried to keep track of the days by marks on the boxcar walls, but the rhythm of rail and ration blurred the hours. They passed through French depots, then to Le Havre, where the docks swarmed with olive drab and English voices. The voyage across the Atlantic was cramped, but not cruel. Guards remained distant, formal. No one explained what awaited them. When the ship turned southward near the American coast, the women stared out at a shoreline that looked too green, too vast, too unscarred. The mountains rose slowly as the trucks climbed from the Piedmont into colder air. And it was then, as one wrote later, that the first feeling of safety took hold. Not joy, not peace, just the absence of immediate threat. Many had lost brothers on the Eastern Front, or fathers buried near Stalingrad. Some no longer knew where their homes stood. Their uniforms no longer fit properly. Their papers were creased from being passed through too many hands. Arrival in Madison County was no celebration, but it was not degradation either. There was no roll call shouted in anger, no shaved heads, no humiliation. Just a clerk with a notebook, a guard chewing a toothpick, and the low rumble of a wood stove already burning in the barracks. The mountains loomed around them like sentinels, indifferent and immense. At night, coyotes cried and the wind slid down the ravines like a whispered warning. One woman, a former field clerk from Dusseldorf, later wrote in a post-war letter, "I did not know silence could make the ears ring. The silence of the mountains was louder than gunfire." For many, it was the first time since 1939 they had gone more than 2 days without hearing an air raid siren. The war had ended for them in motion, in trains, in boots, in silence. And though they did not yet know what awaited in this strange land, it was enough to be still, enough to be away from craters and fire. Enough for now to sit on unfamiliar soil and try to remember how to feel human again. The murmur began at the back of the chapel during Wednesday evening service, barely more than a rustle of hymnals and disapproving glances. But by the time the sewing circle met again, it had grown into something sharper, more defined, a resentment, braided with grief and conviction. Word had spread, as it always did in towns bordered more by gossip than fences, that the quilts piling in the sanctuary chest weren't destined for orphans or wounded soldiers, but for the German women down at the barracks. Mrs. Keener, the deacon's wife, and a woman known for her meticulous Sunday hats and even more meticulous opinions, stood at the foot of the quilting table and said plainly, "We're warming the hands that packed bullets for Hitler. Is that charity, or is it betrayal?" No one answered immediately. Needles stilled. A spool of red thread rolled gently off the edge and spun in silence. For a moment, it seemed the circle might break apart right there, intentions unraveling like a poorly tied knot. Mrs. Tuttle's jaw tightened, her son's name still fresh on the war memorial plaque, and even Miss Ella May, who had started the whole effort, kept her eyes lowered to the hem she was finishing. The tension thickened until the door creaked open and Reverend Bryant stepped inside, coat dusted with snow, Bible tucked under his arm. He hadn't been invited to this session, but he'd heard. Quietly, he approached the table, opened to the Gospel of Matthew, and read aloud. I was a stranger, and ye took me in. I was naked, and ye clothed me. He paused, not to explain, not to persuade, but simply to let the words settle like ash. Then he closed the book, looked each woman in the eye and said, "Charity isn't clean. It doesn't always feel good, but it's what we're commanded to do." He left without another word. Some nodded, others didn't, but the sewing resumed, slowly at first, as if every stitch had to pass through a second judgment. Not everyone returned the next week. Mrs. Keener stayed home, sending sugar for the tea, but none of her hands to work. A few women stitched with tighter brows, making fewer jokes, checking the alignment of each patch, as though precision could dull discomfort. Yet still, the pile of finished quilts grew. A young girl, barely 16, embroidered a cross into the corner of hers, not out of pride, but out of pleading. A widow stitched her husband's name into a seam no one would see, perhaps hoping to remind herself what side she was on. The moral tension did not vanish. It coexisted with the labor, folded into each corner and stitched beneath every verse. And in that quiet defiance, against bitterness, against vengeance, they continued. Not unanimously, not easily, but deliberately. It was the smallest woman in the group, a former radio's clerk from Würzburg with ink-stained fingers and a habit of standing near windows, who appeared first the next morning, quilt folded into a neat square clutched against her chest like an offering. She said nothing as she entered the chapel, only walked forward slowly and placed the bundle on the first pew before stepping back, eyes lowered. Tucked into the top seam was a scrap of paper, torn from a camp ledger and written in pencil with tentative curves. "For the warm and the not cold heart." The grammar stumbled, but the message did not. Miss Berta Jane found it during cleanup, read it aloud to the others, and something in her face shifted. Not a smile exactly, but the easing of some inward brace. That note became the first of many. Over the following days, others followed suit, returning quilts with words scribbled on ration cards, tobacco wrappers, even flour sack paper, all in broken English, stitched together with guesswork and risk. Thank for the good sleep. Not enemy. Cold is enemy. This make memory not hurt. These small, strange letters drew the curiosity of the women who had sewn them. They began bringing dictionaries tucked under arms and old grammar primers borrowed from attics and schools. When a prisoner asked, haltingly, what grace meant, the word sewn into the corner of one quilt, the answer took an hour, passed between needle-pricking fingers and the rustle of translation attempts, the silence punctuated by nods, frowns, and eventually a shared laugh. "Forgive," one woman tried to explain, drawing a heart on a scrap of muslin and crossing it out, then drawing it again. Again heart. "Yes?" The German women repeated the word, "Forgive." Their accents curled around the syllables, but they held on to it. Lessons became informal but persistent. A chalkboard appeared in the chapel one afternoon, wheeled in by the pastor's niece, and soon it bore simple phrases underlined in red. Peace is not surrender. Home is where quilt stays. You are not alone. The language was not fluid, and the fear of error hovered thick in the air, but each attempt chipped away at the old silence like sunlight through frost. The quilts, once mere layers of stitched fabric, became flashcards of mercy, objects that carried not just warmth, but context, memory, instruction. When one woman pointed to a patch and asked, "Why enemy love?" the answer came not in a lecture, but in the gesture of hands opening, palms up. Over time, the guards stopped watching so closely, and the chapel no longer felt like a checkpoint. It became a classroom of sorts, quiet, reverent, stumbling, but alive. And in that stumbling, language turned into bridgework, the grammar of grace taught not through fluency, but through the courage to try. The evidence lay not just in memory, but in ink, in the cramped ledgers kept beneath the pulpit and the folded envelopes stacked in the chapel safe. Rows of figures, annotations, and trembling cursive that charted a quiet campaign of care far more organized than it first appeared. One page, dated November 21st, bore the heading, Quilt Fund, Special Collection, beneath which were 17 names and the amounts beside them. 15 cents from the Crawford twins, $1 from the mill foreman's widow, 4 buttons, and a spool of navy thread from Mrs. Gaines, who had no cash but wouldn't be left out. A separate column marked materials, listed donations less common than coin. A bag of faded cotton from a decommissioned curtain, 2 sacks of raw wool, a bundle of sewing needles tied with blue ribbon. A note scrawled in the margin read, Mrs. McGill offered her last skein of red, insisted it go to the boarders. In the pastor's logbook, wedged between entries on funeral services and storm damage to the roof, whole pages were devoted to inventory. Soap collected for laundering finished quilts, tallow candles for night work, biscuits brought to sustain late gatherings. These were not spontaneous acts. They were sustained ones, layered and deliberate. Even school children contributed, some offering up their extra chalk for the chapel lessons, others donating handkerchiefs, many of which became part of the patchwork. In one ledger, next to a list of names from the sewing circle, a separate line read simply, Anonymous, 6 pillowcases, and 2 prayers. These records did not shout. They did not justify or defend. They simply tallied. But in those tallies, something took shape. A movement that no one had named, but all had fed. Tucked into the back of a tithing ledger was a torn scrap of paper, faded at the edges and folded in half. This is the only good I've done with my hands since my son died in Sicily. The name was never written, but the pen strokes trembled with the weight of it. Another note in careful print read, Let it go where it's needed. Don't tell me where. These micro-documents, when laid end to end, built a portrait of resolve that had outgrown the moral debates from weeks before. The act of sewing had become not just a salve for German women shivering in foreign coats. It had become a reckoning for the town itself. Each envelope, each ink blot, each crossed-out line on a list testified to hands moving not from certainty, but from conviction. In the quiet arithmetic of giving, how many yards, how many buttons, how many hours after supper, a community wrote its legacy, not in proclamations, but in practice. It started as a whisper in the general store, sharpened by frost-bitten mornings, and a growing unease that the war, though far away in miles, had crept too close in principle. By the time the letter appeared in the local paper, penned by a concerned father and printed beneath a bold-faced headline, its message echoed what many had only dared mutter. Why are we feeding the enemy while our boys freeze at Bastogne? The editorial, tight with anger, accused the churchwomen of softness, of confusing Christian charity with cowardice, of making quilts for the very hands that cheered when American cities were bombed. It struck hard, landing between hymnal verses and over breakfast tables, forcing conversations in whispers and sideways glances. Some women, already uneasy, folded their sewing for the week, claiming errands, illness, weather. The pastor received a letter with no return address. If my son dies and they stay warm, you'll answer for it. Even the children heard the rumble. A schoolboy spat near the chapel steps, muttering, "Traitor stitchers." Inside, the atmosphere changed. The room was still, but taut, like thread pulled too tight. Yet the quilts continued, not in defiance exactly, but with a new gravity. Each patch was double-checked, each seam more firmly pressed, as if precision could silence accusation. Meanwhile, the radio in the chapel office, a battered set with a cracked dial, buzzed to life each evening with the BBC broadcast. It carried news of Germany's retreat, of bridges bombed, of the bitter siege at Bastogne, where American troops dug foxholes into frozen earth and supplies arrived only by prayer and parachute. The irony stung. Some women, listening as they stitched, kept their eyes low. A few paused when hearing familiar regiments mentioned, fingers going still on cloth. Could a quilt warm a woman whose husband shelled Antwerp? Could mercy, once offered, be revoked? The questions unspooled in silence. Outside, winter deepened, the river edged with ice, and the trees stood stripped and brittle. Inside, the stove burned hotter, fed by tension as much as coal. Still, the sewing continued. Not because the doubts vanished, but because stopping would make the doubt final. Miss Ellermay said little, but arrived first each week, bringing tea and kindling. Mrs. Tuttle sewed faster than before, jaw clenched, needle flashing. Even those who'd once hesitated returned, not smiling, but steady. The letter in the newspaper sparked arguments, but not a halt, and perhaps that was the answer. Not a triumphant defense, not a sermon, just continued motion. The quilts were not approval. They were not absolution. They were the town's answer to its own turmoil. An insistence that war might dictate enemies, but not the terms of compassion. And so, under the low static of war reports and the high wind skimming down the ridges, the thread kept moving, quiet and unbroken. The final quilt came together slowly, not by design, but by necessity, assembled from what remained after a season of labor and contradiction. Odd scraps of plaid too bright to match anything else, slivers of calico with floral prints worn ghost pale, a rough square of blackout curtains stiff with dust, even a corner torn from an old baptismal robe whose lace edge had survived both moths and mourning. It was February now, the thaw tentative, the ground still hard in the shadows, and the chapel smelled of ash, and wool and lemon oil rubbed into the floor to honor its long service. The women gathered for what they knew was their last session, shoulders brushing at the long table where the final layers were spread out. The quilt was not beautiful, no symmetry, no clear palette, just warmth cobbled together, honest and whole despite its awkward seams. As they worked, one of the POWs entered quietly, a woman named Ilsa, who had spoken the least during her months in the camp. She hovered near the stove, clutching her elbows, then took a step closer and asked in halting English, "Can help?" Her voice was soft but sure. There was a pause, a moment thick with all the weeks behind them, before Miss Berta Jane nodded and slid a chair back. Ilsa sat, lifted a threaded needle handed to her by the pastor's niece, and began to bind the edge. Her stitches were uneven, too loose in places, knotted in others, but no one corrected her. No one flinched. The quilt turned slowly in their hands, passing from one pair of fingers to another, each woman adding her touch in silence. A spool rolled off the table and was caught mid-fall by a girl too young to remember the start of the war. Someone refilled the teapot, someone else adjusted the oil lamp. And the stitching continued, clumsy and deliberate, binding not just fabric, but something heavier, the season's arguments, its small defiances, its quiet endurance. The German woman didn't speak again, but she didn't need to. Her hands, shaky but insistent, told the story. The binding went all the way around, imperfect but finished. When they held the quilt up at last, it looked like a map of everything they'd been through, frayed, mismatched, weathered, but it held together. The women did not cheer. They simply folded it, carefully, and placed it in the chest with the others. The chapel was quieter than usual that day, the stove ticking softly, the windows fogged. Outside, the snow had melted into patches, and somewhere beyond the ridge, a river had begun to move again. Inside, for just a moment, the war felt farther away than it ever had. The numbers came later, tucked into quarterly reports stamped with army insignia and typed in blocky courier font. Dull reading at first glance, buried among supply audits and personnel movements. But somewhere between line items for soap rations and requisitions for winter coats, a pattern emerged. The female POWs assigned to Madison County recorded the lowest incidence of respiratory illness among all camps in the southeastern region during the winter of 1944-45, not marginally lower, significantly. The medical officer's notes were brief but telling. Minimal frostbite, no pneumonia, adequate bedding distributed early. What went unstated, but widely understood by the local guards, was that adequate bedding meant quilts sewn by hands not on payroll. Another report, this one from the Education Liaison Office, noted that English comprehension among the German women in this camp was measurably higher than in any other holding facility east of the Mississippi. Vocabulary tests, conversational assessments, written letters, all showed accelerated progress. A footnote speculated, informal engagement with local civilians may be contributing. But behind the bureaucratic language was something clearer, a proof of concept that had nothing to do with ideology and everything to do with outcome. Disciplinary incidents were almost non-existent. No contraband discovered, no attempted escapes. One guard's post-shift log simply read, "They don't look at us like enemies anymore. Not exactly like friends either, just two people." In a system built on containment and control, this quiet shift didn't register as revolutionary, but the metrics told a different story. The quilts were never meant to be data points, yet they became exactly that. Soft infrastructure wrapped in warmth and ambiguity. Their distribution coincided not just with rising morale, but with smoother logistics. Fewer sick beds meant fewer medical transfers. Fewer language barriers meant more efficient instructions on work details. Fewer disciplinary issues meant fewer interventions, less paperwork, less tension. The costs were low. Reclaimed fabric, volunteer labor, no line item needed. The results were measurable. In a war obsessed with efficiency, the women of Madison County had unknowingly created one of its most effective morale weapons, not by obeying command, but by following conscience. They hadn't set out to improve camp operations. They hadn't meant to model a case study in humane containment. They just hadn't wanted the women to freeze. And in that decision, fiercely debated, quietly carried out, they offered something that, by all military logic, should have been irrelevant: dignity. What they stitched was not surrender, not softness, but stability. The mercy they offered did not undermine order. It fortified it. It made the war, for a few square miles, a little less cruel. And long after the reports were filed and the quilts worn thin, that mercy remained the unmeasured variable, the one that made all the others possible.